Democracy encourages mediocracy. It's a new word. I am grateful to our friends from Harrow for suggesting this, and we've decided to adopt it because I think both in that country and this, the power of the media is something that has to be experienced to appreciate and behold. So speaking for the motion, Riti Bhattacharya from Adamus School.
Do you know what it feels like to be bullied? If yes, you're one of us. If not, you're either a member of parliament or a member of the press. I, Riti Bhattacharya, stand here to speak for the motion, Democracy encourages MEDIA-OCRACY. What I found on the internet when I was searching for the word is that there are so many definitions of the term mediocrity that it is like a hat that has been worn by so many people that the shape of the hat itself has been deformed. But nonetheless, I have a more or less accurate definition, which is that mediocrity is something that is utilized by the mass media, and it is used to maintain control over the people under the perpetration of the guise of freedom of speech. Now, what this brings me to is that media has always been an influential part of democracy. In fact, I can say that democracy and media essentially comprise one thing, and that is consensus, or lack thereof. But what I see in history is, if you know that the Vernacular Press Act of 1878 that was issued by Lord Lytton, the then Governor General of India, who said that he wanted to prohibit nationalist press because he was so afraid that should the Indians decide to rise against this sort of autocratic government and establish one similar to that in United Kingdom. But this just proves that media and democracy have been coexisting. Now, the proliferation of media houses in recent times, especially in India, which is the world's largest democracy, merely show that governments, albeit grudgingly, admit that the media is required, and an impartial media especially focuses on both the achievements and the follies of the current government, and it brings to the fore that we are essentially making use of something which is given to us by ourselves. Now, if you look at the Arab Spring of late 2010, it was a series of anti-government attacks and uprisings. Social media was heralded as the main force behind the motion, simply because news of success stories in one particular country swiftly inspired the other countries to either depose their would-be dictators or governments. And we can see that the world has moved not only from a global democracy, but towards a global media-ocracy. Social media presence has been required to such an extent that there have been many political leaders who have decided to open up and set up their own social media platforms so that when the time comes, they can very well come to the fact that they can ask for support in that public base, and they can ask the people to vote for them, and for one day, for heaven's sake, not stay glued to the Facebook news board. But what we have seen is that Donald Trump, a person like Donald Trump, was a person and a presidential candidate who was created mainly with the help of the media, because he did not take any, he did not refuse any sort of, yes.
Pause the time, please.
What we say to the fact that Trump's main supporter, Fox Media, only 1% of Americans watch Fox Media?
I am not talking about that. I'll just tell you the fact that Trump himself never rejected any sort of sitcoms, to appear on sitcoms in various cameos, and to deliberately file attention-seeking lawsuits so that the media would cover everything and anything that Donald Trump had to say. So when the time came for him to actually make those preposterous claims, which he is making, as you all know, the $5.75 billion wall that he's to make, we can see that the media has been supporting his claims, and, well, he is the president, isn't he? Thank you. So I would like to carry on in saying in conclusion that there is something, and this is my personal experience. Earlier this year, Member of Parliament from Trivandrum, Shashi Tharoor, was in the City of Joy recently, and he was asked to exchange his seat with the host of the interview. And he said something to us at the moment, which his former boss at the UN would tell him, that is the late Kofi Annan. And I quote here that in the world of democracy, the photographers are the ultimate dictators, unquote. And my subsequent speakers will be focusing mostly on the negative aspects of MEDIA-OCRACY and how the advent of social media has created the rise to MEDIA-OCRACY. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Riti. You have two more questions which you could ask. Yes, go ahead, please.
The speaker very kindly spoke about India during the era of British control, but I would like to remind her that India wasn't actually run through democracy during that time. It was run in a totalitarian manner by the British. So what would she comment on this?
I can see why you would jump to your own defense in this situation, but let me remind you that Indians were, the kind of democracy that India was accustomed to during the British rule is vitally different from the democracy that is supposed to be taking place. So I really, when we look at the representation of the the central legislature or the Viceroy's Executive Council, they consisted mostly of British. Even the Secretary of State for India was British, who needed to have lived in India for only 10 years or more, who could take a decision about a 70-year-old Indian aristocrat. So thank you.
So, thank you for answering my question earlier. I would ask you, you claimed that Donald Trump was made by the media. I would say that he got the exact same amount of coverage as his main opponent, Hillary Clinton. And in fact, his main supporter, Fox News, is only watched by 1% of Americans.
I heard that earlier. But I would like to repeat, if you have not heard.
But what is the question this time?
My question is, if Donald Trump got the exact same amount of coverage as other main candidates, how can you say that he was made by the media?
Is there anything to prove that? Because I would like to quote Benjamin Disraeli here, who is the former Prime Minister of England. There are three kinds of lies in the world: lies, damned lies, and statistics. Thank you.
All right, Riti, thank you very much. You can take your seat now. So may I invite the first speaker speaking against the motion, Asap Chaudhary, to take the microphone, please.
I would like to start by refuting the definition of the proposition for what mediocrity is. According to the Oxford English Dictionary, not the first speaker, mediocrity is the dominance of the media over the government, not its people. This can even be said as a collusion between media and the government. We are not saying that media does not have power in a democracy. As a matter of fact, we are saying that media is fundamental to democracies, just as the first speaker said in India. As a matter of fact, it is both media and democracy that check and balance each other. Both sides, democracy has laws and regulations that give them power, and media promotes the democratic process by distributing information and promotes democracy's interests, such as transparency, accountability, and the truth. Importantly, it is held accountable by not only the government, by also its readers and the people. Moreover, media's ability to expose the government expose the government and inform the public also means that it is a force for good, ensuring that a truly democratic body is in power. We would also like to say that social media is a part of media. However, it is a more democratic and more fair form of media than traditional media such as newspapers and channels. And therefore, media encourages democracy and is not in itself a mediocrity.
You've mentioned that there is a system of checks and balances between the media and a democracy. But there is, in fact, no such system, because if democracy happens to impose a system of check and balance on media, then that would, in other words, be called censorship on the media, which is not what democracy should be.
We are not saying that the government is censoring the media. We are saying that it promotes the freedom of speech and the freedom of correct information being disseminated. We're saying that abolishes fake news, for example, not that it censors media. There are checks and balances between the two, not one controlling the other. They are equal. They coexist, as your first speaker said. With that, I would like to move on to my first point. Perceptions, expectations, and priorities of people drive democratic change, not media. Democratic parties are chosen on whether they best represent a person's interests. A single mother in social housing has needs that are unchangeable and cannot be ignored by media and the government. She will not read, for example, the Times and suddenly vote for right-wing conservative parties that don't satisfy her needs for home, for housing, for food, and for education for her children. Similarly, on the other end of the spectrum, a businessman or business owner will not change their needs for example, for lower taxes or deregulation after reading liberal newspapers such as The Independent. If these needs are completely ignored by the media, then the democratic process would not exist at all. As a matter of fact, it does. We see this come into play in the 2018 Italian election. People's anger and frustration with the EU and their growing worry of immigrants were championed by Salvini's right-wing Conservative Party. Despite most newspapers in Italy, as a matter of fact, 4/5 of newspapers in Italy and media in Italy having a leftist or liberalist perspective. So despite the media, people's worry and people's preconceptions and people's perceptions and expectations of the government is what won them over, not the media. So how can we say that media has control and is in fact a mediocracy in the world, when it is people's expectations, as I've said, that controls what happens in the government, as should happen in a democratic government? The media has then one purpose. Well, not only one important I'll take it in 1 minute. Has one...
No, there is a point of order. Okay.
Yeah. Has one important purpose: the dissemination of information and the upholding of democratic processes.
Mentioned that it's people's expectations that form the government and not media perceptions. But wouldn't you accept the fact that people get their information at the end of the day from the media? And if media tells them to think something, then people may as well start thinking in that manner. Therefore, expectations are often determined what media wants them to think. Isn't that a power of media itself?
Of course, media has its own opinions. Sorry, not media has its own. Of course, media has an opinion. But there's so many different kinds of media, and what my second speaker will talk about, the plurality of media, that determines whether whose opinions are championed. If you don't like the right-wing conservative views of one newspaper, you can simply click off or unsubscribe and go to a left-wing or centralist newspaper. You aren't told what to think. You are given multiple views in a democratic media. Now, to wrap up my speech, I would like to say that media is important to democracies. However, media and democracy are in tandem, and there are checks and balances between each other. If you believe in a democratic system, and if you believe that media is democratic, you should vote for side opposition. Thank you.
Stay on. There is an opportunity for an interjector to ask. Oh, you have another person.
So you spoke about how the government doesn't have control over the media, which in fact ensures the freedom of the press. But in that case, since you say that the media has an opinion, a fragmented opinion or propaganda might be used against the people to frame popular public opinion or majoritarian public opinion that goes against what the principle of democracy stands for.
Sorry, what was your question? That was a statement.
So stating those facts that the government doesn't control the media and the media has its own opinion, how would you guarantee or ascertain the fact that the media's fragmented information or any form of propaganda that spreads through the media won't affect the functioning of a proper democracy?
Thank you for your excellent question. Now, like my fifth speaker will say, there are laws that prevent fake news from happening. And if you wait, you'll find out. Thank you.
You
Yeah.
have one more question, Asaf.
Yeah, you have one more question
One
to
more
finish.
question.
Yeah.
I'm Shani Basu from the Martino for Girls. So you said in your speech that the media helps government promote transparency, but considering the numerous examples of how certain political parties control media houses, don't you think they'll show the public what they want, which is why it's the absolute opposite of transparency?
There are multiple media outlets. Of course, there will be slightly conservative newspapers. But like I said before, if you don't want to hear conservative news, then you just don't go to a conservative media outlet. Thank you.
Thank you. We have
Yes,
the
sir.
second speaker for the proposition, Soham Datta from Vivekananda Mission School.
Now, my arguments primarily stem from the fact that we live in a representative democracy, something which is prevalent both in India as well as in UK. So, in such a democracy, media plays a very crucial role because at the end of the day, it's the people who elect the leaders, and the sole source of information for the people is the media. Now, the primary purpose and most fundamental purpose of media is to provide relevant, neutral information. Now, what the challenge for media becomes is to sieve through all the information as well as misinformation that's floating around. They have to sieve through all this information and decide what is truly correct and present this to the common people. Now, often what happens is they cannot decide on what is truly neutral, and they have to present all sides of the single story. What this brings into the system is a certain degree of biasness. Now, whenever a common man listens to all these biased views, it appears to him that political ideas differ. Now, it is then up to him to decide what it will be for him, whether it will be the ideologies of the pro-government companies or the anti-government companies, to state an example. Now what I can say is, as my fellow friend on the other side said, that MEDIA-OCRACY does not control. It says that media encourages democracy. That's what he said. But don't you think, I quote Ben Tweed here, he said, I don't care who does the electing, as long as I get to do the nominating. So it's the media who decides who are these people who will be competing. What are these agendas and the ideologies which will be thrown around? And the people are merely the mediums who are fed these ideas and given to decide that this is what you can accept or this is what you can accept. So every political party will then try to go about and make these people happy, the media. And hence comes the MEDIA-OCRACY part. Media rules by staying in the background. Media.
The gentleman has suggested that the nomination of candidates for presidential elections and the presidency itself is controlled by the media. What would he respond to the idea of a social media bypass through nominees and candidates for presidency speaking directly to the people through social media?
Exactly. See, I can give you, there is a third aspect to it. Whenever a political party has to elect a leader, there has to be sponsorship and backing. And the way he needs sponsorship and backing is by initially controlling a set of people, which are led to these sponsors and leaders by the media. So it's up to the media to decide that I will let the leaders to come in contact with these particular set of people. So media, by acting as a biased conduit and a biased filter, essentially decides who will be the primary leaders. Now what happens is, as I was continuing, this brings in an unnecessary sense of biasness. So it's up to the people then to decide that I will be for this person or I'll be for that person. Now, to come to my second point, any imposition, however, made on the rights of the media will simply be labeled as an attempt to curb the freedom of the citizens. Because at the end of the day...
Okay, pause.
How would the speaker account for different types of not biased media? How would the speaker account for different types of media, all with different political leanings influencing upon one person? I believe the speaker is almost thinking that each person is only influenced by one media affiliation, whereas there are many which contribute to one's view.
Yeah, I thank you for your question. That's a very good question. But the point to make here is, we think of media as a neutral authority, right? The media is not supposed to initially reflect any political views. So it's through the sieving of information that the various political biasness occur. So it's not even sometimes up to the political party or the leader to decide which media company will support me and back me. So in a way it happens sort of in a circular loop, right? It depends on the person that if he wants a political backing support, then he will go to the media. But the media, in turn, has no idea whether that party has secured a majority or not. So in this loop, you have to decide whether the minister will win or the media companies will win. So in a way, this is how it's being controlled. Thank you very much.
All right, carry on.
Now, as I was saying, any imposition on the media, however, will be seen as an attempt to curb the freedom of the citizen. Because at the end of the day, in a democracy, the primary purpose of the media is to reflect the common political views, to reflect the views of the common man. Now, if any government or anti-government third party tries to make any imposition on the freedom of the citizen, this will be simply taken as an attempt to curb the freedom of the press. This will simply be taken as an attempt to show that the common man's voice is being hindered. I finally make another point, that media, no matter how biased or unbiased it may be, is the sole source of current information. Sitting on 6th of April, the only source of information that can provide any sort of relevant information is the media. No other book or no other source in the entire world will provide you information that is relevant to today. So media...
Point of order? Okay.
You say that this media bias, or the media gives information to people and this shapes their view. But also, people would you accept that people make their view based on their socio-economic circumstances, and media cannot change, reading a paper does not change their needs and expectations of political parties?
That's a very good question, and thank you for your question. But see, in a country like India, where economy truly plays a very important factor, the media understands that. And the media plays to the expectations and lack of expectations of these people. The media, in turn, makes them believe that their aspirations will be supported by a particular leader and not by the other, whereas it could have been very easily the other way around. So it's the media that ultimately decides who the person supports, and not necessarily on what that leader will do. Thank you for your question.
Okay, we still have a little time. We could take one more.
Okay.
You want to wrap up?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Yes. And so, as I was saying, the media is the current source of information, and nothing can replace media. So at the end of the day, it is true that media and democracy are two members of a symbiotic relationship. But if you take media at the forefront, that is when democracy loses out. And this is what is happening in the current pro-modern democracies. Thank you very much.
How would the speaker respond to the fact that in the UK, much of initial electoral processes do not receive much, if any, media coverage, and that they are allowed to elect their politicians for the party in peace and by themselves?
Okay, thank you for your question. But the thing is, when media does not report, media observes. The sponsors, initially in UK, I believe, when the political parties have to select a leader, every candidate has to have a certain degree of sponsorship behind him. Now, where will he rope in the sponsors from? That's where the media companies' connections come in. Even though the media does not report at that point, it advertises. It ropes in the people who will ultimately take this political person and make him one of the candidates who is inside the competition. So media at that stage might not be reporting, but is very much present there in the situation. Thank you very much.
George Minge from Harrow is our second speaker against the motion. George has been very persistent with his questioning as well, which we deeply appreciate. Thank you.
I find it quite telling that this early in the debate, there is already a significant amount of rebuttal to be had. The Indian rule, I find it hard to believe that the proposition believed that this was democratic. I've never heard someone say that totalitarianism is highly democratic. That's not the whole principle of it. Statistics are the basis of mankind and how the world and progress is measured. So if that's the greatest lies, there's very little point in holding a debate, as there is no evidence to go off, and we may as well leave right now. And finally, if social media such as Facebook, as mentioned by the proposition, is anti-democratic, then why is it banned in China? That is something that I find very hard to ignore. So, democracy, what is it? It's the rule of the majority of the people. For democracy to function, everybody is required to participate, each and every person. They must be mobilized through education so that they're able to participate with enough information. Without media, one is unable to participate. What are sources of media? Well, you have newspapers, the internet, such as social media, and it's important not to forget radio. This allows people to form opinions so that democracy can be upheld. The media is good for democracy, as it simply portrays the facts, allowing citizens to form their own opinion. Now, before the proposition rebut this, I would like to give them the example of the British Broadcasting Corporation in England, which is owned by the government, but it is run at an arm's length. This means that it is legally impartial, which is hugely important, because this level of impartiality allows democracy to be upheld by providing the people with information without indoctrinating them politically. The BBC is not a newspaper, and the introduction of finding out information online, which is increasing day by day, has helped reduce the effect of the media bias spoken about by the proposition, which I'm sure they will wish to continue to exaggerate. To be clear, because of this level of impartiality, a mediocracy is not possible, as news sources such as the BBC have no influence over the government, as they are impartial and no influence over the media.
All right, point of order.
So you spoke about how the Facebook is banned in China, and you asked us why is it so. So don't you think the fact that China curbs the power of communication media and the opinion of the public, don't you think that ascertains the fact that communication media is powerful enough to change public opinion?
Of course, it shows that communication and media has the power to change opinion. But also what is important is to think about what the motion is. The motion is democracy. And I would not define China as a democratic nation if they are censoring what the people are able to see. I think that is a very important factor in this debate. Moving on. Media plurality. In the UK, The Telegraph, The Times, The Guardian are just some of the daily publications, with The Telegraph being more conservative and The Guardian being more socialist. India, you have The Indian Express, The Telegraph, The Tribune, are some of more than 100,000 daily newspapers. These are all privately owned publications, which the proposition seeks to falsely indoctrinate people. But to think for a moment, democracy runs on freedom of speech, freedom of thought, freedom of press. So all these different points of view build up a balanced portfolio of newspapers, which we like to call media pluralism, as there is no bias because there are opposing opinions clashing. Furthermore, democracies promote freedom of speech and thought, so people can choose what they want to read, meaning that they have control.
Okay, point of order.
Yes.
As you've mentioned that in India, some of the channels are, of course, leaning on one side, either for the government or for the parallel government, then how do you explain that Mr. Punna Prasun Bajpai had to exit from ABP and his show Master Stroke was entirely wiped off the face of the TV because he had shown Narendra Modi? Wouldn't you say that in that aspect, government controls the media?
Could I ask the speaker to speak a little slower so that it's easier to understand her?
All right, I am sorry, I
All
apologize. However, if you say that the government hasn't a control over the media, then how do you explain that in India, in ABP News Hindi, Mr. Punya Prasun Bajpai, just a few days ago, was forced to go out of his show, and Master Stroke was wiped off the face of the TV only because they were showing present government in a light that wasn't very complimentary.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Honourable Lady for furthering my point about media pluralism. There are over 100,000 newspapers in India. To be precise, 105,443. So the fact that one newspaper outlet is being controlled by the government does not change the fact that the people choose which one they would like to read, and the people choose what their opinion they would like to form, which is democratic and is not mediocrity. Seeing what one wants to see is democratic, as I've just spoken about, because the element of choice is there. And however, when speaking of a balance of plurality, I would like to rebut the point of what the second honourable speaker of the proposition, where he spoke about propaganda. There is a difference between media for information and propaganda for false indoctrination. Propaganda is highly undemocratic, and if this propaganda were to indoctrinate the people, it would be undemocratic. And therefore, it is not relevant to the motion, because we are speaking about how democracy and mediocrity are combined, not how an undemocratic society and mediocracy are combined. However, it is also important to differentiate. In newspapers, there are opinion columns designed to show you what the journalists think. But then there are also sections which are fact, which are reports, which show you what has happened, not what the journalist would like you to think.
One more point of order here.
No, thank you.
Okay.
Furthermore, more and more information is being disseminated through the internet, and this has caused a greater source, transparency and reliability through the media, which gives negative press less and less power. According to Forbes, there has been a 57% increase in users of news sites online rather than papers in 2017. This gives the media a lack of control. And just finally, to conclude, the propositions speak of a totalitarian media that controls the state and the government. But I would like to suggest them Donald Trump, who uses a social media bypass to speak directly to the people. He felt that media had gained too much power, and therefore he must speak directly to the people in order to get the correct information across, showing that with democracy, mediocrity cannot exist. Because if the media gains too much power, the leader is simply able to communicate through social media to get his messages directly to the people without editing. Thank you very much.
So, would you like to take the question now?
Of course.
Yeah.
You've mentioned that here we are talking about democracy and mediocrity and not a government and not a society that is not democratic. But India is the largest democracy, and that is what we are trying to prove to you, that a democracy is not a utopian concept. Democracy is not what we find in the political science textbooks.
Thank you very much. I understand your question. Of course, India is a highly democratic country, and democracy is not a utopian subject. But within a society that is democratic, there is not going to be 100% democratic newspapers. Within England, there were undemocratic newspapers during a phase of a highly democratic society. About 5 years ago, the Daily Star was a communist newspaper. What this is showing is that through the pluralism of media, whilst there may be some newspapers or media that wish to indoctrinate the people, there is a clear idea that with such a wide variety of media, there is no way that we can say it's undemocratic, as the people have a choice of what media they want to read. And the whole idea of democracy is that people have a choice of what they want to do.
History should never be in confusion. Both of you, some of you have been in confusion about self-government in India. That did not happen till about 1930. So when the Vernacular Press Act came in 1878, you are factually correct, there was no self-government in India. Self-government only happened in the 1930s. How would you react to two assertions? One is the most totalitarian state ever designed and functioning on the face of the planet, North Korea, is actually defined as a democratic country. And both the head of states, they are governed by people who are actually dead. They are not alive. And the second point is, the only Soviet state that was not affected by glasnost is supposed to be the BBC. There are more social media channels on the bias, the incorrigible left liberal bias of the BBC than the BBC itself. How would you react to these 2 points of information?
Well, I would like to thank the Right Honourable Gentleman for providing me some bait to further this debate. I think that when he speaks about North Korea and the definition of democracy, it's very important to think about what the definition is and what it is in reality. With censorship, I do not believe that's democracy, as the people are simply not choosing what they are reading. They're being told what to read by the state, and that is highly undemocratic, leading to the idea that it's not democracy. It's not really relevant to the motion because we're talking about democracy and mediocracy. I think the idea that the people in North Korea are not allowed to leave the country, not allowed to use the internet, which are all democratic ideas, shows that whilst they may define themselves as democracy for propaganda, they are not truly a democratic nation. And in response to his second point, which I have slightly forgotten, the BBC.
Okay. That's a convenient amnesia.
Would he be able to just remind me of his second point?
Stuff around about the profound bias in BBC. It is thought to be the last refuge of the incorrigible left liberal sanitized communist intellectualism.
Well, I'm afraid I would have to say to him, I don't agree with that. The BBC is an impartial organisation, impartial by law. Now, if they are breaking the law, then obviously there needs to be an issue that is solved there. But that is not something that we are able to debate in this debate, because we are debating the principles rather than real occurrences within society. The BBC is designed to be an impartial service, which I hope he will realise and oppose the motion tonight, this morning.
Well done, Mr. Minge. That was a lovely, lovely speech, a great defense, and a lot of questions that you handled with great aplomb. Arav, are you ready? Arav Midha from La Martiniere for Boys will speak now, and Arav emerged as the winner at the event in his school. Arav, floor is yours.
The topic placed before us reads, Democracy encourages media-ocracy. And I, being a member of Team Proposition, will prove to you how true and valid this topic really is. The modern media has been able to convey up-to-date political information for less than, I think, about 2 centuries now, thanks to rapid development in electronic media forms and technological advancement in printing. Over the years, newspapers have been transformed from a platform of expression for the upper class to a voice of the masses, especially in democratic countries where the freedom of speech and expression are prevalent. It serves as a platform to discuss, debate, and publish their views on a government of a country. However, this took a turn during the rise of feudalist governments in the 1910s. As the relationship between democracy and the media has been considered throughout the 20th century, much attention may be given to the extent of media effects, especially following the experience of government-produced propaganda during the 2 world wars. An example to elaborate my point would be the censorship of media during the Nazi regime. During that time, the newspaper, the People's Observer, was the primary newspaper, and it hid the cruelties and crimes committed by the Nazis. But also, on the other hand, it also promoted the rise of the Aryan race and also anti-Semitism. In this way, we can see how people's freedom of speech and expression is snatched, which should be unacceptable because everyone in this world should be able to express their views.
Okay, point of order.
Is propaganda not the government controlling the media as opposed to the media controlling the government?
So, thank you for your question. So, in a way, the topic is media-ocracy stands for the government which utilizes the media. So, the media utilizing the government in order to prove something, and in this case, we can see that if a government uses propaganda, and if new media outlets have centralized control, we can see it eventually becomes a part of the government's tools and their policies. A free press can be crucial for any democracy because it may contribute to the transparency of a government, which is a key factor in most democracies. The freer the press, the more there is an improvement in the democracy of a country. The private ownership of media outlets, instead of centralized control, allows the press to assume different roles in society. A free press can also serve as a kind of watchdog, monitoring government activity and improving its functionality, efficiency. On the other hand, state-run media agencies.
You mentioned the watchdog nature of the media. However, we're arguing that this is in fact the checks and balances that I previously talked about between the media and the government. Not media controlling the government, but media holding democratic values and ensuring that that democracy is fulfilled. Therefore, how do you respond to this?
So, as responded by my fellow colleagues, which was a refutation of your point, the checks and balances that you talk about eventually in the long run are propaganda. So, to continue, the media can also help build peace and also social harmony, without which democracy is impossible to function. And it requires the active participation of the people. They can provide different opposing groups with solutions for mediation, representation, and a voice so that they can settle their differences in a peaceful manner. Media independence is guaranteed if these organizations are free from centralized control, they are financially viable, and are not under influence of any person whatsoever. Efforts to help the media should be directly towards the protection of press rights, enhancing media accountability, building media capacity, and democratizing media access. Several countries, such as China, North Korea, and some African countries, censor the media in order to hide what they don't want to see and want to prove what they want to see. This, however, is a gross violation of one of humans' most important financial rights.
All right, point of order.
No, thank you.
No.
It is freedom of speech and expression. And being in a democratic country, we should use this consciously for the good and not for the harm of our country. I would like to end with a quote by Thomas Jefferson. Were it left to me to decide whether we should have a government without newspapers or newspapers without a government, I should not hesitate a moment to prefer the latter. Thank you.
Speaker, as someone with German heritage, I find it incredibly difficult to accept that the Nazi regime was democratic. During war, a country is in a state of emergency. There is no democracy. The government has control.
So thank you for your question. So to answer this, we can see that the Nazi regime it started off as, a promise to make a country better, but it ended with its eventual decline and its demise. So we can see that the democratic views that you might have asked me to talk about were not a part of this. And we can see that about a year after the Nazi regime had been established, they forcefully annexed some countries around Czechoslovakia in order to, expand its territory, and with a lot of bloodshed in the future. So that's not...
All right. Thank you very much. Coming up next to oppose the motion is Theodore Seeley.
Mr. Chairman, esteemed judges, and ladies and gentlemen of the House. I would first of all like to discuss a point raised by the proposition regarding the information spread by the media. Human beings are not drones. They do not merely swallow information. They digest that information and decide what to make with it. That is the point of democracy. They use the information given by the media in order to make informed decisions in a democratic process through processes of accountability and truth. So, as the opposition, our aim is to make you see the flaw in the concept that democracy encourages mediocrity. I intend to do so by proving to you that the media's influence over the public, which by definition represents democracy, is limited. Why? Well, simply because the media reflects the opinion of its users, viewers, and readers. I will use British newspapers to highlight my point, and can guarantee that any form of media in any existing democracy with freedom of press will also work. The British newspapers, the Daily Telegraph and The Guardian, have very different political ideologies. The former is conservative, and the latter is socialist. The owners of media platforms are interested in making profit, which is especially clear in the case of newspaper owners, who are primarily interested in boosting circulation figures. It is also true that people read newspapers that broadly reflect their outlook, thus showing newspapers usually confirm existing political views. Newspapers are notoriously partisan, as was highlighted in the case of the Daily Telegraph and The Guardian, and hence attract readers of their respective ideologies. They cannot merely alter allegiances of their political philosophy without risking a huge negative impact on the numbers of their reader base. This is because if, like the proposition may claim, media changes its outlook in order to affect the way people vote, thus trying to have power over democracy, and...
Order, Mr. Seeley, would you take them now?
I'll take it a bit later, thank you. Leading in the direction of mediocrity. They run the considerable risk of not respecting the political views of their base of readers. And if so, their readers may merely change the newspapers in order to read information that satisfies their political leanings. It's quite possibly potential financial suicide for papers to merely switch political allegiances in an attempt at altering the way people vote. And thus, it's not a risk that they can afford. The papers, and hence the media's desire to influence democracy, is limited, and it is clear that the reverse influence is stronger, which is to say that democracy's influence over the media limits its power to a greater extent, therefore preventing its ability to install mediocracy. The mirroring of the political opinion of its users, viewers, and readers limits the power of the press in pluralist democracy.
The readers, the viewers are not the publishers or the reporters or the writers. There isn't any such Whistleblowers Protection Act that protects the person who comes out of the regime and protests about it. So what do you say to it, to the fact that the publishers are the ones who are publishing the news, and whether the readers like it or not, whatever news they read is leaning on one side or the other. Not everybody is a balancing scale. How would they get to how would they get to the truth in the end?
I would like to reiterate 2 points that have previously been mentioned in this debate. The idea of pluralism, that biased medias are on both sides of the argument, and also the fact that people are not drones. They can make educated decisions using both sides of the argument in order to come to a democratic process of decision-making. So, to reinforce what I've just mentioned, the second speaker of the opposition's point about plurality of the media reinforces my statement. The strongest democracies have wide ranges of media, as a free and diverse media is a vital feature of a healthy democracy and plays an essential role in upkeeping freedom and democracy. In this country, which holds dear to its heart the fact that it is the largest democracy in the world, there are a wide range of views which are represented throughout the media, in fact, over 100,000. The media represents these views and thus helps democracy. And instead of having power over it, democracy rules over the media. And if the media does not have the power over democracy, then in what instance can a mediocracy possibly be installed?
The speaker, sir, has time and again said through his speech that the different forms of media primarily reflect the common public opinion. And he has also said that the definition of plurality that I in my speech provided goes on to furnish his own opinions. But what I want to ask him is, how do you explain pluralistic ignorance then? A system where the media itself propagates certain political parties, which in turn convinces the common people that that is the idea which the other people around them believe. So essentially, the media is providing options A, B, and C, and ignoring option D. So if the people themselves have no idea about the fourth option, how will they choose the right one?
I would like to thank the speaker for his very interesting question and discuss the fact that through the rise of media and the direct chains to option D, people are able to obtain the information without the bias of the press and can therefore make an informed decision through option D, whilst also regarding the points of options A, B, and C. So, I would like to conclude by saying that the media, and most especially the press, reinforces rather than changes political attitudes. There are differing views on websites, blogs, and forums, so it is unlikely users, viewers, and readers will actively seek out those that conflict with their own views. With such a range of political outlooks, the media cannot afford to risk its base of followers by trying to alter their political perspectives. The media is contingent upon democracy. The media depends on democracy. The media needs democracy. And if the media reflects the opinion of its users, viewers, and readers instead of influencing them, it is clear that instead of the media influencing democracy, which it would do in the case of a media-ocracy, the media has no dominance, control, or rule over democracy, thus showing quite the opposite, that democracy influences the media, therefore showing democracy does not lead to mediocrity. I rest my case and urge you to vote against the motion. Thank you very much.
Spoke about how in a democracy, the media is reflecting the ideologies of the people.
Absolutely.
Right? So in a democracy, a media is supposed to be free of such control and should be reporting what has really happened, giving them the true political opinion. But in fact, when they are framing the political opinion based on what the people want to hear or what might be attractive to them, isn't that a self-defeating purpose for the media itself and gives them control of framing public opinion?
I would like to reply to the speaker by saying that the information that is provided by the media may reflect the people's views, but does so by holding the government accountable by giving them different views on what the government has done, thereby offering the public with information and helping the public to make such an informed decision. By holding the government accountable and by providing the truth, even if it does have a spin on it, with the availability of different medias, there is very easy the possibility of people ingesting all the information, whether it be from the right or from the left, communist or fascist, if you so wish to speak about such extremes, and make an informed democratic decision. Thank you.
The next speaker is Urshia Sarkar from Le Martiniere for Girls.
In the words of American political activist Noam Chomsky, propaganda is to democracy what the bludgeon is to a totalitarian state. Now, ironically, a democratic government, which is said to be the finest form of governance that encourages debate, discussion, and disagreements, regularly takes recourse to manipulating the mind of the common man by perpetuating its own beliefs and ideologies through the media and ostracizing those who are not in resonance with theirs. And that is where the role of the media comes in. The administration floats the alternative media or resorts to media-ocracy. American author Daniel Isaac Schechter, in his book, The Death of Media and in the Fight to Save Democracy, defines this media-ocracy, and I quote, as a toxic media environment in which nothing, not even illegal wiretapping, is immune from being reduced to mere politics. Close quote. In our country and in other so-called democracies, we find that before any general election, all political parties, they pay huge sums of money and engage in media management. They hire professionals whose only job is to use the media to project and present the party's nominees as the perfect candidates to be elected as the people's representative. Opinion polls are rigged, and the media is corruptly used not just to report political events, but to shape them. Now, a burning example of this is, as said by my first speaker, is the president.
Ore, would you like to take this now?
Okay, sure.
This honourable lady has clearly stated that the amount of money spent on campaigns is rigging the election and influencing the people. But how would she respond to the fact that during the Brexit referendum, the Remain campaign spent 9 million on the first day on pamphlets, and the Leave campaign spent 7 million in the whole campaign, and they still won?
Thank you for your question, sir. I did not state that the money that is being spent rigs the campaigns. I said the money is being spent on to campaign to project the representative as the perfect candidate. So, as my first speaker mentioned about the 2016 presidential election of the United States, two pieces of fake news were reported by the media, and they were to a large extent responsible for the outcome of the election. Firstly, the news that Hillary Clinton sold weapons to the ISIS, and secondly, that Pope Francis endorsed Donald Trump as the presidential candidate. The above pieces of news were liked and commented on by hundreds of thousands of people, and 60% of the respondents in a survey claimed that they believed that the latter headline, that the Pope released a statement in support of the Republican candidate, was accurate. Now, this kind of immoral and unethical usage of media can only result in making it increasingly powerful, irresponsible and destructive of democracy. Now, today, in our country, we find that even when there is an assault on secular or democratic fabric, the secular or democratic fabric of our nation, the political leaders are more absorbed in using the media to achieve their ends rather than give out a public statement to reinstate the faith of the people in the freedom of the state. Now, a so-called democratic government seeks to continue in power, leaves no stones unturned to manipulate the human psyche through newspapers, radio, television, Facebook, Twitter, and other forms of mass media. Now, the Goebbels' big lie theory has been practiced on the common man over and over again through the decades in all democracies of the world, wherein he said, and I quote, "It would not be impossible to prove with sufficient repetition and a psychological understanding of the people concerned that a square is in fact a circle. They are mere words, and words can be molded until they clothe ideas and disguise," unquote. Ladies and gentlemen, some people are wise, our opposition is otherwise. So it's very sad that, like the lotus eaters, they choose to exist in a state of ennui, refusing to question Goebbels' big lie. But as a member of the proposition, I have hope that there will come one day where, in the true spirit of Abraham Lincoln's vision, the real power to choose will belong to the people and not to the media, who surreptitiously misguide the democracy. Until then, you may say I'm a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. I hope someday you will join us and the world will be as one. Thank you.
You talked about fake news and specifically Pope Francis endorsing Donald Trump. However, is the speaker not aware that after that article was released, within a mere hours, the media site and article were hounded by fact checkers and by other media, and it actually ensured that the democracy was carried out because the article was seen as fake news, and the democratic process was allowed to continue, and there was no fake voters and fake things. So how can you say that the media did not act as a democratic did not act democratically?
Okay. Thank you for your question, sir. Now, there were no fake voters for the presidential election campaign, at least in this context. Now, the media, when it reported that Donald Trump had received the Pope's blessing as the best candidate for the job, people's opinions were swayed because of the media. And even though corrective measures were undergone, people's opinions after that were not changed that easily. Thank you.
The Honourable Lady has spoken about a huge amount at the beginning of her speech about propaganda. Now, I would ask her to reference back to my speech, where I spoke about the fact that propaganda is falsely indoctrinating the people, which is undemocratic. And using her example of Hitler, it's showing that I would also ask her to no longer reference, I do not believe it to be relevant. I believe that she's showing how mediocrity can function in an undemocratic state, not in a democratic state. So would she agree that this point does not stand?
First of all, I did not say anything about Hitler. And secondly, I mentioned the United States of America, which is a democratic state. And this is where my example took place. So I believe that your question is wrong. Thank you.
All right, yeah, she was not the speaker who mentioned Hitler. It was one of the previous speakers who did, actually, yeah. All right, thank you. Thank you very much. Coming up next to oppose the motion is Mr. Samuel Odell.
Mr. Chairman, esteemed judges, and ladies and gentlemen of the floor, I am delighted to be talking to you today about why democracy does not encourage mediocrity, but I must be given some rebuttal. In reflection on the first speaker's point that Trump was created by the media, this is simply fake news. And this is completely false, as Trump was repeatedly attacked by the media for various scandals. And he even deemed the New York Times a failing New York Times. And so the point that media created Trump and encouraged him is completely false, as they didn't promote him. In response to the second speaker's point about sponsorship, the media are legally not allowed to give a nominee specific power, and they must balance between various candidates. It is instead people's opinions and the opinions of the parties which they are members of, which will back not what the media want, but what in democracy we want to see as a nominated candidate. Anyway, moving on to the crux of my argument. I'll start with a quote from George Orwell. Freedom of the press, if it means anything at all, means the freedom to criticize and oppose. And so media exposes scandals of policies, which in turn promotes freedom of information. America's First Amendment by the Founding Fathers states that Congress must not make any laws restricting the media's ability to, and I quote, petition the government for a redress of grievances. Hence, Media is needed to assist the democratic system on the public and how they must know what their leaders are doing before we can surely vote for them and enact a policy. An example of this, where the media has affected by exposing government scandals, is in the press in the UK exposed the Windrush scandal, when before 1973, people from the Caribbean were immigrating into the United Kingdom and were only given cards which confirmed that they could stay in the UK indefinitely. However, these cards were inevitably lost as they were not applied with the usual standards of having passport stamps, for example, and in fact the government was exposed for destroying and apparently losing records, and then deported these people back to their native lands. The Guardian won the Amnesty International Award for 2019 for this exposure. Theresa May even apologized for the actions of the government beforehand, and therefore media...
So, Dale, will you take it later?
Yes, please.
You had mentioned that the economy, that is the most powerful people with all the money, do not have a role in media. But how do you explain advertisement expenditure if you do not further the cause of those that are supporting the newspaper by advertisements? Then that newspaper doesn't exist anymore. So advertisement is a form of control over the media.
Well, as my fifth speaker will elaborate, there are laws and regulations which regulate how much media can spend on the advertisement for a campaign, and as I already mentioned, that we must have a fair representation of these nominees. So your question is not valid that there is a bias in spending. Anyway, back to my point. The media encourages democracy with its ability to expose scandals. So media does not control government, but helps people to control the government by informing people of pieces of information before the electorate can vote. Anyway, moving on to my second point. Media not only exposes policy scandals, but corrupt individuals. This is good influence and leads to freedom of information to the people who will be voting for these politicians.
Second point of order, would you take it now?
Yes. One more.
That by exposing scandals, media exerts some form of a control over the government on behalf of the people. However, by exposing the scandal of one government, media plays a role in bringing another government to power, which is essentially the opposition, also known in a democratic system as the parallel government. So media supports either a government or a parallel government. Either way, wouldn't you say it is a form of biased behavior?
No, I get your point, but the media is providing information to the people which they can do further research in to see the primary fact. People, as my fellow speaker has said, people are not robots. They can clearly see between the lines that there are biases, and people will choose their media on the points that they want to hear. And so your point that it is biased to replace a government is invalid, and I will further explore this in my example of the Watergate scandal. By this freedom of information, governments must face consequences for their own actions. The Watergate scandal in 1972 attempted to cover up Nixon's illegal attempt to re-election via the perhaps appropriate committee, CREEP, the Committee to Re-elect the President. The Washington Post and reporters Woodward and Bernstein exposed the FBI investigations to the people, resulting in Nixon's eventual resignation. Exposure of corruption of officials encourages democracy rather than controlling the government by people again being able to see when they are voting all the primary facts, as I wanted to answer your question earlier. Media is a vital tool for democracy to be enforced lawfully, free from deceit and corruption, and so instead we must see democracy as a function and helping democratic government, not dominating it. Thank you.
Third point of order.
Yes.
Scandal, but that is possibly the only example you can cite in that regard. However, if we talk about the Hillsborough disaster, where Sun had reported all sorts of fake news, wouldn't you say that it went against the interest of the people and not for them?
Can you please repeat more slowly?
Turn on your pace a little bit, yeah.
You have mentioned the Watergate scandal, which helped replace the Nixon government, which was in fact in favor of the people. However, we can also cite the Hillsborough disaster example, where fake news that was printed on the front page as the truth wasn't essentially the truth at all, and it went directly against the people.
Well, by pluralism, we can clearly see that there are multiple exposures of these facts, and so that this bias is not fair. There is the example of Mr. Coulson, who was exposed for lies in the media being spread And so the media clearly has no actual power to be able to assert just one view in a democracy. I hadn't quite finished my last point. Thus, we can see that it is not the control of the media, as the proposition would argue, which is controlling the government, but is our freedom of information, which is exposed by the media. And by, as I quoted the First Amendment of the American Constitution, it is the most important part of a democracy. If you vote for this motion, then clearly you are not supporting how democracy functions in the modern world, and so we must vote against the motion. Thank you.
We'll just move on to the next speaker for the proposition, Aditi Mishra from the New Time School.
In an attempt to try and define democracy, with my 14-year-old level of understanding has made me realize this. Democracy is where the state head is elected after a lot of public deliberation, consultation, opinion sharing, and definitely consensus. Funnily enough, or maybe in a not so funny way, the same deliberation makers and opinion givers gaze at these so-called elected heads, looking up at them with awe and say, who elected these? It wasn't surely me, not us. And mind you, the tale rings true not only in our nation, but in our very own revered USA. And thus comes a time when it all becomes a superfluous endeavor to elect someone of someone's choice. In a democracy, the thinkers, the intelligentsia, and the think tank promoters are rarely being heard. Their voices have been drowned by the majority, who, it's probably needless to say, are the non-thinkers and the herd followers. What democracy inherently has in its fold is the encouragement of herd mentality and voices which aspire to be heard. Actions.
Okay, there's a point of order. Would you like to take it now?
Yes.
Yeah.
The Honourable Lady spoke about the principle of the majority voice taking control, and she was speaking about the minority being ignored. But surely that is the very principle of democracy, that we take the path that the majority want.
You can answer it at the end of the speech in case you choose.
Okay.
No?
So as I was saying, that now heterogeneity is the very essence of human civilization. Uniformity takes away from it its charm, essentially rooted in variety and its myriad nature. But democracy ensures that heterogeneity is ruled out and the bland and banal uniformity gets established in its place. And why so? Because if a crowd is heterogeneous, then there is bound to be a stray voice here, a stray action there, and so many other dissent-like occurrences challenging the very sanctity of democracy. Democracy, as it stands today, is for the insecure and inhibited. It pleases and placates the average because the average keeps the hearth of democracy fueled. The average, the mediocre, I repeat, are the non-thinkers and conformists, a lackey or two, and definitely those who would rather be in the herd than be seen as a shepherd. Yes, democracy makes little boxes made of ticky-tacky, little boxes just the same. These boxes are us people who wouldn't dream about breaking or bending any rules, and will take all the bitter and sweet in our stride only because it makes us feel safe. And feeling safe is all that matters. Now, why do I feel a meritocracy and...
Another point of order. We want to take it up now or later? Yeah, now.
Would the Right Honourable Lady like to address the fact that the very fact that we are talking about the power of the media suggests that we are a long way off hegemony?
Long way off?
Hegemony.
Hegemony.
Sorry?
Hegemony. Hegemony.
Okay.
Would you like to respond to it now or continue and respond later?
Later.
Okay, carry on.
The media, as always, will play to the gallery and
serve in the vested interest of those in power and rule out merit to establish average and their average thoughts. The media today is challenged because it does not aspire to take any challenges. Meritocracy is out, the average, and their media fanaticism is in. Today's democracy stands at this terrible juncture. Thank you.
All right. Would you like to take up those questions now?
The first question was whether the rule of the majority in a democracy, isn't that what democracy is all about?
Yes, democracy is about the opinion of the majority, but then these majority, they do not include those minority people who are facing other problems, and they are in some way not
Not represented in the opinion making.
and they're not being represented, exactly.
The second question was whether or not, about the hegemony part, whether, so would you like to respond to that? And you have one more question to take.
Thank you very much for your speech. In your answer to the first question we raised, you stated that the minority don't have their views heard. Would you not argue that social media, a form of media, allows those minority to circulate their views and their experiences and what they believe to everyone? So essentially allowing the media to show their views, giving them a voice in democracy.
Yes, but these voices, they aren't always heard, and they are in some way left out. So this is what I'm speaking about. That not everyone has access to social media, in India at least. So
what do you mean to say that these voices on social media do not reach the quarters that
yes,
matter?
Yes,
Okay,
they
fine.
are left out in some way.
Right. You have one more question to take? Oh, the answer to the other question, yeah.
The
simplify
answer,
the question?
would it be okay if the next speaker will include that in his speech? So thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Okay, now we have the next speaker coming up to oppose the motion. That's Mr. William Wacho.
Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to begin my speech with some brief rebuttal. The third speaker for the proposition was talking about the Nazi regime and about how their silencing of media, which he stated was a problem. However, he attributed this to the democratic values of the Nazi state. However, the Nazi state only started to silence media and to cause this problem once they had turned away from democracy. Only once Hitler had revoked the rights of the German citizen to free speech could Goebbels begin to silence the media. Secondly, in a point of information given to the fourth speaker for the opposition, the last speaker for the proposition challenged us to come up with more examples where the media had intervened with government and had shown all government's almost dirty laundry. Two more examples of this would be the Vietnam War, where the atrocities committed by the government were revealed to the people, eventually halting the war in which these horrible acts were being committed, and the expenses scandal given by MPs, which stopped them from essentially using taxpayer money to fund their own lives and their own luxuries. Mr. Chairman, esteemed adjudicators, members of the floor, and honourable members of the proposition, I would like to begin by stating that in a mediocracy, power is vested within the media. In a mediocracy, power is invested within the media. However, we have laws and we have regulations to prevent the media from gaining too much power and becoming a dominating force in our society. These include defamation laws and governmental inquiries. Defamation is the act of spreading mistruths and actively lying about someone's character or someone's actions in a manner which damages them. So this is illegal. And so an example of this would be the famous Wagner versus Harbour Radio case in 2018. The Wagner brothers were construction workers who built a dam in Australia. They also built a quarry to go along with the dam to supply it with materials. Unfortunately, shortly after the construction was finished, the local area flooded, killing 5 people. There were 2 inquiries into the event. both of which cleared the Wanya brothers' construction of any blame for the event, and even stated that the quarry had mitigated the results. Despite these inquiries, Mr. Alan Jones on his radio show made 76 defamatory comments over 26 episodes of his radio show. He claimed that they were responsible for the
There's
flooding.
a point of order. Would you like to take it now?
I would love to take it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Example of the same in India. A student of Delhi University, Kanhaiya Kumar, had raised a slogan against the government apparently when he had done nothing of the sort, and he had been arrested for the same. Defamation
I'm sorry.
is widely...
Could the speaker please slow down a bit?
I think we should have a remote control to reduce the speed.
In India, a student of the Delhi University in Delhi, Mr. Kanhaiya Kumar, had been arrested on grounds of defamation. Had been convicted on such grounds because of things that he had never said. You see, defamation in India is also used as a political propaganda, because what happens at the end of the day is on Times of India, you have these cartoon pages, you have cartoon slots, and all the cartoonists are more or less always arrested
All right, you should
on
quickly
grounds
come
of
to your
defamation.
question. Yeah.
Wouldn't you say that defamation is a government propaganda at the end of the day also?
Thank you very much. I'm sure, so just to get this straight, this person was arrested for defamation on claims that he had never made. The process of arresting people under made-up charges does not strike me as particularly democratic. It almost bears the hallmark of a totalitarian government. So if the government had truly engaged with democracy, they wouldn't have arrested this person. Could I take it at the end, please? Thank you. The Wanya brothers took Harbour Radio to court for their defamatory comments and ended up winning, gaining a settlement of $3.7 million, showing media everywhere that they could not create mistruths about people and get away with it. Another example of the government and the laws regulating media is through inquiries. So unfortunately, in 2002, Millie Dower, a 13-year-old English schoolgirl, was reported missing by the police. Her prospects were not good. Her parents were advised to begin the mourning process. However, journalists from News of the World Media, one of the world's largest news conglomerates, hacked into Millie Dower's cell phone and accessed her voicemails to see if there was some information they could get to put into their next article and to see if they could get a step ahead of the police. However, Millie Dower's parents saw that her messages had been open and jumped to the conclusion that Millie Dower was still alive, wrecking their grieving process and giving them false hope. When Millie Dower's body was finally found in a wood, they were crushed. Their false hope had lifted them up and they'd been slammed back down to earth. They sued News of the World conglomerate and were offered $2 million in personal damages. This phone hacking scandal led to the infamous Leveson Inquiry. This was an inquiry led by Lord Leveson, a member of the British House of Lords, into the malpractices of the media. He discovered that many of the media were phone hacking and were using other forms of malpractice to gain insights for their stories. This inquiry ended with the arrests of the deputy head of communications for number 10 Downing Street, the office of the Prime Minister, along with the arrests of Rebecca Brooke and the chief executive of News of the World, and other senior executives, along with the resignation of the Metropolitan and Deputy Police Commissioners in the UK for their failure to deal with this. This shows that the government was not afraid to stand up to media. In fact, News of the World, shortly after that event, announced that they would be shutting down. The government had taken on one of the world's biggest news organizations, proved it corrupt, and had shut it down. The government had shown its power over the media. The media did not frighten the government. The government had the authority and had the courage to take on the media and not be cowed by their power. If the media is so powerful, how could the government do this? I rest my case, and I hope you all vote for the opposition.
You have mentioned that arrests of people on grounds of defamation to serve political ends is the hallmark of a totalitarian government. A speaker on the side of the opposition previously had mentioned that that India specifically is known for its plurality of media. At the same time, you're hailing India as a democracy that calls for plurality of its media, also a totalitarian government. Aren't you contradicting your side?
I would like just some. Okay, so I'm not sure what relevancy the plurality of media has to the actions of the government. The government has sole control over who it arrests. The media may call for someone, the media often in America calls for Donald Trump to be impeached and arrested and sent to jail. He hasn't been impeached yet, unfortunately. So that doesn't really apply to the plurality of the media in a way. I hope I've answered your question. If there's a follow-up, I'd love to answer it.
I'm Poulami Sarkar from Vivekananda Mission School, and thank you for whatever you just said. But I would like to come up with another context of fake news. We recently know about the problem between India and Pakistan. The fake news that came up during that time, don't you think that was mediocracy which controlled the nation with fake news for a while?
So with the subject of fake news is obviously a very pressing one. I'm not familiar with your exact example, but there's a principle you can apply to this. So there's a law called the right to be forgotten. So essentially, if I believe that a particular web page or website on Google is promoting misinformation about me and is misleading the people towards myself and my actions, I can formally request that that page be taken down off Google, and Google is formally obliged to do it. So if the page is misleading and if the page is, if the page is creating fake news, then there is a legal obligation to remove it. And in this way, the government is regulating the media and is preventing the spread of fake news, vesting power within itself and not with the media. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Bosho. I don't think we have any further questions, so you may take your seat.
Thank you very much.
Shubhadeep Basu from St. Xavier's School.
Now, as I was sitting there for the last 1.5 hours listening to the speeches made by the speakers of side opposition, I was reminded of a very famous expression from Texas, which says, all hat and no cattle. The motion that stands before us today reads, democracy encourages mediocrity, and I stand here firmly proposing the motion. At the very onset of my speech, let me clarify some of the misconceptions which have been brought forth in today's debate by the speakers of side opposition. They've come up here and talked about a utopian concept of democracy and talked about democracy as a theory and an idea. If it doesn't exist and comply to what the standard norms are, it doesn't exist. But ladies and gentlemen, let's look at the semantics of this motion. This motion states democracy encourages, which refers to a simple present tense or the present time frame. What they have failed to do is differentiate between the concept of democracy and its application in a true democracy and the majoritarian form of democracies in today's world, which are democratic republics, which are different in essence, and which brings in the concept with which they were questioned about the fifth speaker from side proposition. When she came up here and talked about minority rights, democratic republics bring in the inalienable rights that are guaranteed to the minorities, which is in fact a form of democracy. Moreover, they have come up here and told us how democracy controls mediocrity or how a mediocrity controls the democracy. Ladies and gentlemen, we are not here to debate about whether they are controlling each other. It's not even in the motion. It says encourages, which simply means stimulates the development of or something that is conducive for something. So if we can prove that the media is utilized in a democracy, that simply proves our point that the democracy is encouraging a mediocrity. Now I'll move on to my constructives. My first constructive is based on how the role of media is negligible when it comes to a free press. Now what we need to realize at this point of time, that in a true democracy what we have is a free press. But members of side opposition come up here and say, no, a media has opinion. And they come up and say that media also has transparency. The first speaker of side opposition comes up here and tells us two different aspects of a coin and tells us that he's not contradicting himself, but tells us that media can have opinion, but they are also transparent enough to give us their own opinion. Yes. Yeah, sure.
Would the Right Honourable Speaker not recognise the difference of opinion columns and news reports?
Fine, okay. So what you need to realize is that they came up here and talked about how Trump was subject and privy to 1% of Fox News. Ladies and gentlemen, how much of a newspaper comprises the opinion column? A very negligible amount. And that same very 1% comprises the opinion column in a newspaper, while other are news reports. So we clearly see how it forms a majoritarian form of point of view which people get. Now let me come to my most important fact today,
Point
which
of
is the
information.
advent of social media. I'll take it in a
Yeah,
minute.
another point till later.
I'll take it in a
Okay.
minute, yeah.
Okay.
So the advent of social media. Now today they have come up here and talked about as they are bona fide members of the respected Wall Street movement because they seem to know everything about the social media. Because they come up here and say that social media doesn't do anything at all. It gives us an opportunity to express ourselves. Ladies and gentlemen, although it gives us an opportunity to express ourselves, it surrounds us with like-minded people. We are not only the receivers of news, but we are also the ones who are providing and contributing to it. I'll come to your point of information. Yeah, so what happens is that, in that point of fact, what happens is that people are subject and are providing news information to it, which leads to what we call incestual amplification. Although the minorities, as you said, have the right to express their opinion in social media, it is bogged down by the majoritarian view, which brings us to the fact that majority is established in social media, in which we are, in fact, aiming at public opinion, and a majoritarian public opinion, which in fact leads us to form a majoritarian form of government and a democracy. Yes, I'll come to your question.
Yeah.
Is the majority deciding on the representation not the very definition of democracy?
Okay. So you talk about how the majority is the one who's selecting the representatives to the government and essentially how they are forming the government. But sir, how are they privy to the policies that these particular representatives are going to adopt once they come to power? They are available to this form of information via the help of media. They use a medium to get out to the people, communicate with them, and therefore tell them about what they are going to do, and hence frame public opinion. So let me move on to something that has been very important in today's debate. We've talked a lot about Donald Trump. And they've come up here and talked about how Donald Trump used media bypass. Now, ladies and gentlemen, when they come up here and say that he used a certain form of media, he utilized the form of media to gain control of power, it simply shows how democracy has been encouraged in the form of a mediocracy. Moreover, when he talks about how Donald Trump had no effect whatsoever when it comes to social media, ladies and gentlemen, let us remember the Mueller report, which talks about the meddling of this particular form of governance by the Russian government in the US presidential elections. Also, the leaks of Hillary Clinton's emails by WikiLeaks shows how the social media has played and the internet has played a very important role in framing their opinion. Moreover, let us come to how they have talked and criticized us about how we have not used the definition that they want to use, and they have come up here and talked about how they have used the Oxford English Dictionary. I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, they are from United Kingdom. I couldn't decide which one to choose, the Oxford English Dictionary or the Cambridge English Dictionary, because they are, both of us, pretty important to us, and we use them day-to-day lives without any difference whatsoever.
Shubhadeep, you need to wrap up because you still have those
Yes,
questions to take.
Moreover, what we need to realize that today in their speeches, they have drawn conclusions out of nowhere, without any iota of logic and without any relevance whatsoever. If I am to go by their logic of drawing conclusions, I can tell you how a fire truck is read. Ladies and gentlemen, a fire truck has 8 wheels and 4 people in it. 8 plus 4 is equal to 12. 12 inches make a foot. A ruler is a foot long. The Queen Elizabeth is a ruler. There's a ship named Queen Elizabeth. Ships are found in the sea. There is water in the sea. There are fishes in the water. Fishes have fins. Fins with a capital F, as in people from Finland, were communists, and communists are red. Essentially why fire trucks are red. That is the penchant. That is the penchant of relations that they have used in this debate. And if the August Gathering believes that this form of reasoning is illegitimate enough to win a debate, I pity you. I'll come to your questions.
You said the debate whether the government is in charge of the media or the media in charge of the government is irrelevant. But if the government is controlling the media, as the opposition is arguing, and the power is with the government, there can't be a mediocrity as the power is with the government and not the media, and there is no power of the media then.
Okay, so, sir, now let me tell you about the discrepancy in their own arguments. They've come up here and talked about and how they've asked me how they argue as to how the control of the opposition, of the government over the media is something that it's a self-debating purpose. And when they come up here and challenge any particular notion that challenges democracy, and they say that since Democratic People's Republic of Korea doesn't do this, it's not democratic. Sir, can you please tell us what is your stance? At one point of time, you're coming up here and telling us how a certain notion not supporting democracy is not democracy. But then, when it controls democracy, as in a free media or a free press is a prerequisite condition for a true form of democracy, or according to the concept of democracy which you are going by. So such discrepancies in your speech clearly show that you have failed to understand this question.
So I would like to suggest to the Right Honourable Gentleman that I did actually give the definition of democracy in my speech from the dictionary, so I don't think we are going off some fake definition. But further to this, what we are disputing is the fact that the definition given by the first speaker of the proposition is not the real, true definition of mediocracy. And so we would like to say that your definition of the motion does not stand.
So was that a question or a statement?
No, he's just saying that your definition does not stand, yeah? So whether you would like to counter that
But
it
that was a
it
full
stands?
stop, not a question.
No, it was not a question. But
Could
you
please
can
repeat your
respond to it.
Could you please repeat your question? Because that seemed like a statement to me.
I'm asking you whether you would accept the fact that the proposition's definition of the motion does not stand because it has given the incorrect definition of mediocrity.
So as to being a proud member of side proposition, I stand by whatever side proposition has come up with, because they have come up with a general connoted term of the definition which they find acceptable and which they find is bringing in the broader end of the motion and not narrowing down the scope of today's motion to the concept of democracy and not the implementation of democracy in today's world. Thank you so much.
The second last speaker from the opposition, Charles Harrison.
Whilst the opposition have argued that questioned the last speaker on what a mediocracy is, he has failed to put a definition, so I will redefine our own. A mediocracy is when media controls public opinion. And that is what the other members of the proposition have been arguing today. However, I have found many gaps in the proposition's arguments. Firstly, they have failed to say how they have overlooked the real life situations. Media does not give facts which completely confirm what someone thinks, how they view people and their judgment. In real life, people care about what they need. Socio-economic circumstances are the fundamental basis on what people's opinions are based. If someone was on benefits and there was a government proposing to scrap benefits, and they read a paper saying benefits, this government proposes really good policies and it will help the economy, does that not? Would you argue that that person would then support that party? I think not. Secondly, I find there's a gaping black hole in the proposition's logic. Humans are, on the whole, intelligent beings and do not simply believe whatever they read. Otherwise, everyone would, you raise the point of advertisements, and if everyone believed what they read, then wouldn't everyone be buying the shiny red car that advertisers tell them they must have? Thirdly, they stated media sways public opinion and damages democratic health through misinformation and lies. However, fake news is ultimately exposed for what it is. Due to the competition between media companies constantly fact-checked other media companies, as when they expose a media company for lies, that gets far more views and popularity. We raised the argument that the media company that raised the point about the Pope supporting Donald Trump, how much press was covered by that, as opposed to press saying they were wrong. I'd like to get on to my points today, in that media power is not only help democracy and works entwines with democracy, but actually media power is slipping, and so the idea that there's a mediocracy at play is simply wrong. Newspaper subscriptions are falling drastically across the world. Popular newspapers in the UK have fell last year by an average of 3.7%. In India, slightly over a third of the 900-odd million people eligible to vote read newspapers. The same is true for televised media, where only 37.5% of the USA voting population watched the news in the 2016 presidential election. Indeed, in the UK, only 1 in 6 people regularly watch or read the news. Ladies and gentlemen, if people are not watching the whole news and it affects a small proportion of the entire population, how can they argue that it has complete control over the public opinion? The last speaker of the proposition mentioned social media, and I believe he made our point for us.
He talked about how social media is where people make opinions themselves. People see news on social media through what their friends post, what they like, and what they view, and that is regurgitated for them. And whilst traditional forms of media are declining, social media is the exception to this rule. Social media is the fastest growing of all industry in the world at the moment. In America, 68% of the population, as opposed to the 37.5%, say they got their news predominantly from social media. The same can be said in India, where Arvind Gupta, head of BJP's IT division, estimated that up to 60% of seats in this year's election would be determined by social media. These are large numbers, and they show the case that social media is controlled by the people. If people post what they want and their friends read it, it is not a media baron controlling what the media and the people's opinions. Rather, it's the people expressing them themselves. In this sense, social media is in itself democratic. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd urge you to vote with the proposition today. For, as we've argued, media and government support each other through giving transparency, accountability, and the truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison. You appear to have silenced the proposition which is in opposition. Do we have any points of order from the opposition?
The proposition seems totally convinced by whatever you said.
Yes.
Okay, there's one. Yeah, go ahead.
You talked about how social media is ultimately influencing and asking people to express their opinions, which is leading to democracy, you are saying, on social media, and then that ultimately is leading to the people voting for their leaders in the government after one election. What would you like to say to that?
Well, I'd say it's true. People are posting their own opinions, and saying their own opinions is democratic in itself. People have freedom of speech in a true democracy. Whereas in a mediocracy, the media controls their opinions. So if the people are saying their own points and supporting it, surely that is democratic and not a mediocracy.
I'm Srija Das from Leveson Mission Schools. My question is, you say people think about their needs, right? So when we think about our needs, we also compare what the others are getting and what they are not, what's happening otherwhere, every part of the world maybe at large. And when we compare these things, we do so by statistical data provided to us through the media and all, but the information provided by the media. So what would you say in this regard?
Could you slow down slightly and
okay.
just repeat the last
part?
So
when we think about our needs, we also compare what's happening in the other places, what other people are getting, maybe in other parts of the world. So that we get to know from media, the statistics they provide us with and the data they provide us, they feed us with rather. So what would you say in this regard?
Well, if you are hungry, do you need a newspaper to tell you that you are hungry?
People get the news from...
Don't start an argument over there.
And if you're hungry, do you need a newspaper to tell you that you're hungry? If you don't have enough money to pay your rent or fix your roof or pay for heating, do you need a newspaper to tell you that you're hungry? If a government or a political party is proposing solutions to those change, then that's when you support them based on your needs, and that's what forms your political opinions.
Any other questions, either from the proposition or from the floor, from the interjectors? Thank you.
Thank you, and please vote for the opposition.
Thank you for reminding us, Mr. Harrison.
Yeah.
The audience is directed to note that he is in the opposition.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you can use social media in the hall over there, if you were to support him, right? Last speaker for the motion is Disha Sarkar from the BSS school.
I do hope that all our members of the opposition someday go on to create a government of their own. I would like to live in their government because their definition of democracy is very different from the real definition of democracy. Whatever they serve to you is what they serve on behalf of a platter that has been made by democracy. Then they come up with their different and various and diverse and very entertaining definitions of democracy, telling us that we focus not on what democracy is, but on what democratic governments are. If democracy is not a democratic government, then what are we? When we say democracy encourages mediocrity, we try to say that it is a democratic form of government that encourages the media to gain power. Now consider, have you ever been told as a child that you're too young to discuss something? If you have, then I'd say you have had a good education. Because you've been taught from a very young age that when you grow up, you will be told by the media that certain news items are too sensitive for your ears. Indeed, it would scorch your ears to know that democracy encourages mediocrity. Democracy gives to the media krasia, that is power, and that is how mediocrity is created. Therefore, the relationship between democracy and mediocrity is one of love, in Shakespeare's language, one of a marriage of true minds. Because it is in the system that democracy gives to mediocrity its greatest asset, that of plutocracy. Plutocracy is a society that is governed by those that control the wealth. Now consider. News Corps UK and Ireland and associated newspapers of UK control more than 50% of the national press of UK. In India, Reliance Industries recently gulped down Network 18, further bringing down, consolidating the press and bringing it into your notice that the press today is in the favor of people who control the government, either through advertising.
All right, would you like to take a point of order now?
I will take it a little later.
All right, fine, carry on.
Either through advertisements or by directly printing it on newspapers. Our opposition spoke of speaking directly to the people. It is when Donald Trump came and spoke directly to the people that media interpretation was lost in between. You know, the point is, in India, when our Prime Minister comes up and speaks directly to us in Man Ki Baat and he begins with his mitro, our hearts stop beating. Because we are sure it would be the turn of the 2,000 rupee notes this time. It is strange to note that if diverse media is a truth, then how does it not incorporate the opinion of the minority? Coming back to my point, let us go and look into the factor. Let's analyze a newspaper, deconstruct it, and we'll get to the truth. Yesterday's newspaper, The Telegraph, one of the largest selling newspapers in India, in the foreign news section, front half of the page was taken up by Jeff Bezos' divorce settlement. In fact, I can tell you the entire details of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard's divorce settlement case, because that is important news. And somewhere on the top left-hand corner, in a 5 into 3 centimeter block, you had the Iraq floods, which reported on 86,000 people who were displaced and 62 people who died. But you know what is interesting here? That in the other half of the newspaper, there was a large advertisement by Thomas Cook, Smooth Travel, which simply tells you that the advertisers, that is the advertisement conglomerates, the plutocrats, are pleased with the system that is governing the media today. Government is controlling the media, therefore. I would, of course, come to the points, but it is necessary to make the point first. When we talk about government regulating the media, we understand that that is the reason precisely that the northeast of India never finds itself on the newspapers. In fact, it would take a People's Republic of China to come and attack Arunachal Pradesh, for Arunachal Pradesh to come up and tell the national news, hello, we are relevant, we are present here today. How sad is a sad situation when the victims have to depend on their perpetrators to prove their relevance. Now tell me, what do you do to earn your pocket money? In Kolkata, certain older children teach younger ones and they earn something from there. In Hamburg, people deliver
would you
packages.
Like to take one
I
now?
have 3.38
Disha,
seconds
would you like to
later.
take one? Later.
Deliver packages in Hamburg and they earn some kind of pocket money from there. In Kashmir, up north in India, students pelt stones. At government officials, at military officials, in fact, even at apples on apple trees in apple orchards. Their favorite targets are, of course, news cameras, but they don't find any because they have lost relevance. Too short is public memory. Well, Shakespeare had said it, and we prove it. Public memory is very short because when it is controlled by a democracy, it is difficult to say if it is the democratic form of government that is controlling it or not. It is difficult to understand, and I agree that that is the reason proposition is making all its mistakes that it is today. But when you come to think of it, you have to know that democracy is a government of glib talkers.
Your speaking time is up, in any case.
Much like our opposition. And now we come to the questions.
Yes.
Okay, now go ahead.
Mr. Washup, yes, you're first.
Thank you very much. If the relationship between the government and the media is such a relationship of love, as you say, why does the media constantly keep on airing the government's dirty laundry, revealing its secrets to the world? Why does the government keep on regulating media, punishing it when it oversteps the legal bounds? Why is there constant animosity between the leaders of governments, such as Trump, and the newspapers who report on them, such as as he likes to say, the failing New York Times? if all these things happen, how can there be such a relationship of love? Why do these things happen if there's a relationship of love?
Anton Chekhov had said, nothing good is ever accomplished by logic or ethics. Our opposition was paying very close attention to it when he was saying it. It is clear to note, in answering your question, that the democratic government is what is supported by media. Hence, media supports either the government that is in power or a parallel government. Both of them are systems in a democracy. The perpetuation of the democratic form of government is going to ensure the perpetuation of gratia or power of media. That is how democracy encourages mediocrity. Because democracy holds media up. Democracy decides what media reports. It is significant to note that media will report what democracy wants it to report. Also, when you say that newspapers come up with airing dirty laundry of the government, you must understand that they are doing it in favor of some form of government or another. As you have pointed out yourself, most of your newspapers are leaning either to the left or to the right. There's polarization in politics in the world, and that is essential. If they are not favoring the government, then they are favoring the opposition, which is also the parallel government. So you have answered your own question.
You have 2 more questions to take. Yeah.
The speaker arguing that newspapers are controlled entirely by their owners as opposed to paying customers.
If newspapers had depended on the paying customers, then all newspapers would have gone out of business by today. Newspapers are controlled by the advertisement industry. Newspapers are controlled by those who also run the election campaigns. These are the ones with power in their hands. This is a bureaucracy. This is an oligarchy. It is a plutocracy. It is a government where those that control the power are the ones who shift hands between the power centers. But they control the wealth, and that wealth determines. You see, there is this interrelation. How do you balance freedom of speech with freedom of trade? You cannot, because even in both the situations, you have plutocrats coming in between.
Right, you have 1 more question.
Yes.
Yeah.
The speaker very generously stated that nothing good is ever achieved through logic. I find this incredibly hard to believe, given she is standing here in front of us, laying out what she believes to be her logical argument as to why we should propose and uphold the motion. Would she agree the debate is an essential element of democracy, given that is how Parliament runs?
Anton Chekhov, when he had said nothing is ever accomplished by logic, was referring to the opposition in this particular debate, because clearly they haven't understood either democracy or mediocrity or encourages or a system of democracy that has federation in itself, and a federation is built by a lot of people and not just a unitary view, which is also a problem in United Kingdom. And when the opposition comes up and says that News International did not get away with it and that the government regulated its activities, we must understand that Rupert Murdoch is still the owner of 21st Century Fox, which in turn controls most of your news outlets. I'm afraid you have been misled. I'm not saying you're wrong, you're intrinsically correct, because all individuals are right, nobody is wrong, but you have been misled by the media. You have been misled into thinking that there isn't a plutocracy in existence, when very clearly it is. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Jisha. So take your seat. I just want to offer a minor clarification to the members of the opposition here, because the last speaker did mention about the Indian Prime Minister's monkey bath. She said it so fast, it has nothing to do with monkeys. Rest assured. Monkey bath, it's 3 words actually, you see. So it is the Prime Minister who addresses the nation every now and then, and it has nothing to do with the monkeys whatsoever. Okay, last speaker on behalf of the opposition is Dylan Winward.
Mr. Chairman, it stands to speak bounds about the proposition that there's quite a lot to rebut, and I want to start at the beginning with the definition of mediocrity. Mediocrity is when the media controls, not influences lightly or helps a little bit, democracy. This is the first thing we've got to think about. Furthermore, there's no media establishment pulling the strings. Rupert Murdoch's not sitting at the back controlling the narrative. The News of the World scandal and the fact that those people went to prison shows that the media is not controlling our democracy. It shows that the government's controlling the media. Furthermore, people aren't brainless drones that will believe whatever someone puts in a newspaper. As my team has already said, people's needs don't change, people's opinions don't change just because they pick up a newspaper. Otherwise, I'd throw in with our point of view at the proposition. Media is also the plural of mediums of communication. Yes, there's no one at the back controlling the narrative. There's no media establishment. So that how can media control our democracy? And the second speaker for the proposition said that in the UK, leadership elections are decided by the media. But in reality, there's no sponsorship from the media in leadership elections. They get little or no coverage in the media at all, because they're not considered to be as important as a general election. The second speaker also mentioned Hitler, and I think that's an absurd point. You can't really mention Hitler as a democratic leader with a free press in any sort of sense. A member of the audience said that people can say North Korea is a democracy, but it's not, it's an autocracy. I can label myself as a genius, but it doesn't make me one, in the same way that North Korea can label itself as a democracy. It doesn't make it one. He also mentioned the bias of the BBC, a primary example of an unbiased news source, and the fact that it's hated by both the left and the right.
If North Korea isn't a democracy, whereas North Korea says it is, if China isn't a democracy, whereas China says it is, then wouldn't you accept that most of 6 out of 10 countries in this world are democracies, and at least 4 out of 10 are not democracies at all, in your opinion, where you are where you're essentially trying to tell us that there are perfect democracies in existence when that is not at all the case?
North Korea cannot be a democracy. There is one party on the ballot paper. There's only one option you can take, and the other option is to go to a concentration camp. This isn't a democracy. Coming back to the primary point I was making, the BBC is hated by both the left and the right. Surely this is the main advertisement, that it's unbiased and centrist and representative of the people. The third speaker of the proposition mentioned propaganda. But propaganda is an example of the government controlling the media. It's not an example of the media controlling the government. Another speaker also mentioned fake news. But the vast majority of the news on the internet is real. The vast majority of journalism states true facts. News is a culmination of plural opinion. You don't just get your news from one source, you get it from many. So you can make an informed decision about what you choose to believe and what you don't. Also, around the world, there's something called the right to be forgotten. Google will actively delete fake news if it's challenged and proven to be falsely claimed. And there's many examples of this, such as the Google versus Gonzalez court case.
Insistently harping on the fact that we have several news sources, hence can choose what to believe and what not to, or when to shift the source that we get our news from. However, what about those particular news items that are entirely left out of the news? Aren't they relevant?
There's nothing that's completely left out of the news. Everything will get some coverage. So the point we're making is that if there's multiple different news stories, people can be exposed to whatever they want to be exposed. They can read multiple news stories, and there can't be one media establishment controlling our democracy, pulling the strings again. Furthermore, on fake news, only 21% of Americans say they have seen fake news. There's an advertisement to say that fake news isn't a significant factor that's controlling who does and does not get elected. Furthermore, they've argued that the media got Trump elected, which I find to be incredibly strange, seeing as Trump had less favourable media coverage. Vote Leave in the Brexit referendum had less favourable media coverage. Bolsonaro had less favourable media coverage. And what's in common with all three of them? They all won. It shows that we don't have a mediocrity around the world. It shows that the media is not controlling our elections. It shows that that mediocrity is not encouraged by democracy.
One more point of order. Would you like to take it now?
No, thanks.
No, thanks.
Also, the last speaker mentioned a relationship of love between the government and the media. But in reality, I don't think such a thing exists. There's a relationship of hate. Trump is constantly criticizing the media, and the media is constantly criticizing Trump. How is this a relationship of love? The government controls the media does not control the democracy. And we can't be in a mediocrity if only a third of voters in India even read the news. The opposition have failed to respond to Watergate. The opposition have failed to respond to phone hacking, to Vietnam, to expenses, and to benefits. But our rebuttal speaks for itself. Contrary to the over-politeness of my colleague, I urge you to understand the media's juxtaposition and vote for the opposition. Thank you.
Now I'd like to take
the
interjection. Yeah. Go ahead.
You have said that media coverage has not affected election results, especially in America. But wouldn't you say
that showing Trump over and over again 24/7 would give people something to think about at the end of the day, that Trump too exists. All his irrelevant arguments are made relevant the moment he is put on screen so many times. And wouldn't you say that has, to a certain extent, changed people's minds and made them think more about a man who is not really relevant in the political scenario that was then?
The media is not controlling the democracy. The media opposed Trump and Trump got elected. The media said we were going to have a blue wave in the midterms, but that didn't happen. This just shows that the media is not controlling our government, and mediocrity is not encouraged by democracy. Thank you.
You've heard 14 speakers, absolutely brilliant speakers, who've held us mesmerized through this morning's proceedings. I had only hoped that there would be more participation from the audience in terms of raised hands. But before that happens, I will give you a chance. Once again, we'll come back to you. May I now request Mr. Theodore Seeley of Harrow to sum up the case for the opposition in this debate, which says democracy encourages mediocrity.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen of the House and esteemed judges, the proposition this morning have argued many arguments. I would like to just highlight a few of the points the seventh speaker brought up, namely the proposition arguing that statistics are lies, and we would like to argue that they prove points by acting as supporting evidence. The proposition argued that the accountability of the government by the press leads to a mediocrity. Rather, we would like to argue that this provides a democratic process for people to make their mind up using the information given to them by the press. They have argued about fake news leading to mediocrity, and we have rightfully argued about the rights to be forgotten. And the proposition have talked about media bias, and we have discussed the fact that this is removed by the internet through social media, which is democratic, as various people offer their opinions. So, the proposition have talked of holes in our argument and failures of logic. However, they have proposed equally incomplete arguments. At one point, a point was made that since 1% of the American population watch Fox News, and 1% of the newspapers are opinion columns, then 100% of what is read is opinionated, which I think represents a slight flaw in logic. Furthermore, the media was referred to as acting as a medium, which leads to mediocrity. But if the media does act as a medium, then it is merely something people act through, and therefore lacks power, hereby proving that it does not lead to a mediocrity. Moreover, as the seventh speaker exposed, they have left many of our arguments on the table without answering them, whether it be regards to our point regarding Vietnam, Watergate, phone hacking, MPs' expenses, and countless others. Might I even add that the very fact that we are discussing mediocrity proves that we are not in a hegemony, which has been proposed by the proposition, but are indeed in a democracy that is free of the press's control. Though our definitions and logics have been questioned, I can assure you that in essence, we have not argued more than whilst we do not deny that media is important, and indeed its importance is vital to a vibrant democracy. It promotes democratic interests such as transparency, accountability, and truth. The antagonistic relationship between government and media, which the proposition has argued is irrelevant to this debate, is in fact intrinsically linked to the argument. Since the media does not have power over the government, and the government is antagonized by the media, thus leaving the people to decide in a democratic process of freedom of press, thought, and more importantly, speech. And more importantly, thought. Ladies and gentlemen, the opposition rests its case. Please vote against the motion.
Thank you, Mr. Seeley, for sticking to your time. Summing up on behalf of the proposition is Shubhadeep Basu from St. Xavier's Collegiate School.
Members of the House, today at the end of this debate, let me bring and tell you what has happened throughout the course of this debate. Let me talk about side opposition first. The side opposition has been a vehicle of optimism. They have come up here and tried to debate on democracy, the true form of democracy, as a concept. And then they have come up here and said that much of the news that we receive today is true news and not fake news. Ladies and gentlemen, firstly, true democracy is a form of governance that doesn't exist. It is a democratic republic that exists in today's world, in today's present time frame. And when they come up here and say much of the news is true news, ladies and gentlemen, understand that the media is the source from which we receive political information or news. So if we already know, and if we can already differentiate between what is fake news and what is true news, then what is the purpose of media in a democracy, which is a self-defeating purpose in itself, according to them? I find an extreme amount of similarity between today's opposition and Facebook in the way they propagate optimism. Because Facebook is the only place in the world where you can sit in a room and talk to a wall and still not feel stupid about it. Moreover, today's opposition has been extremely contradictory in their opinion. They've come up here and asked us and said that media is transparent, and yet they have opinions. They come up here and expect us to respond to Vietnam War, clearly disregarding the fact that it doesn't refer to the present time frame and it doesn't come under the ambit of today's motion. And they have failed to comprehend the motion in different ways just to prove that either side controls each other and not conducive to each other, completely disregarding the word encourages in the motion, and thus narrowing down the scope of today's motion. While side proposition today has given you a broad-ended stance, given you a more practical stance, they have come up here and described the difference and described the concept of funding in media. They have given you the advantages of a free press in a democracy. They have given you how, they've told you about how media is framing public opinion and hence establishing a majoritarian rule and thus leading to a democracy. And they have also brought in the paradigm of democratic republic into this debate, making sure that we are going by what the debate stands for. Thus, ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to use logic and ask you to use your conscience to understand which side has been able to come up with a rather suitable argument, a rather logical argument, a rather symbolical argument which makes sense in today's world. And thus, I urge you to vote for side proposition. Today, as I end my speech, I'm reminded of my favorite author, P.G. Wodehouse. I'm pretty sure had today's opposition in mind when he had said that they resembled men who had spent the better part of their lives looking for the leaks in life's gas pipes with a lighted candle. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I rest my case.
Thank you, Shubhadeep. Thank you for summing up.
So I'm Parikshit Roy Chaudhary from St. Xavier's Collegiate School. Now, as far as hearing the opposition comes, I'm absolutely reminded of David Foster Wallace when he said that when you ask an old or a young blanket fish, how's the water? The very answer would be, what the hell is water? And that is exactly what the opposition has been doing all day. If we ask them what is a real democracy or a practical democracy, their answer would obviously be, what the hell is a real democracy? Because the fact of the matter is they go by an idealism, and their definition is very idealistic of what democracy is. And that is exactly why they would never talk about the Brexit referendum, which was obviously driven by social media. And of course they would talk about Vietnam, and not about Ireland, because, of course, they are Irish. And just about during May, they had a referendum over there about their abortion laws. And that was also driven by social media. And that clearly tells us that it is social media that is influencing the public opinion. And public opinion is what designates a government, and public opinion is what determines a democracy. However, we must also realize the subtle contradictions that have happened with the arguments of the opposition. Considering the fact that the second speaker spoke about the impartiality or the legal impartiality of BBC, the very third speaker came up and said that the Guardian and the Telegraph are partial newspapers, and that is the amount of convenience that they like to exercise, which, according to history, we all understand. Also, considering the fact that the members of the CDC, we have businessmen and 2 doctors, we would obviously realize that the press does uncover a lot of different things, and that itself would also result in regulations of the government. Considering the fact that we do have 2 doctors, and in India, we have a lot of fake or illegal abortion medical centers that are uncovered by the news media, and then the regulations are established by the government. We must also realize about what fake news is, and the opposition has constantly told us that fake news is being removed by Google from the internet. However, we must realize that fake news already does the damage before it can be removed. And therefore, when one thing does come up on the internet, it stays forever.
All right, all that you said was not fake news, but I still have to remove you from the microphone because your time is up. But just one moment, stay on, because there is a question from the opposition to what you said.
The speaker argued that social media controls public opinion, but who here has a social media account? because I'd argue that many of you do, and that is you who post on social media, not some overarching controlling power. Facebook is not concerned with what people post on social media, so long as their advertisements are, people still buy advertisements for people buying it. Social media is not, doesn't control public opinion, it's an expression of public opinion.
Okay,
Thank
so
you.
that was your opinion now. It was not a question.
Yeah.
Okay, you can take your seat. Person voicing his opinion against the motion.
Hello. I've just got a quick few things to clean up. Firstly, I can't remember which speaker for the proposition mentioned this, but propaganda is a tool used by totalitarian states. I cannot think for the life of me a true democratic state that has used propaganda, and I don't think the proposition could push one forward as well. I find this to be irrelevant to this debate, as the motion clearly states democracy encourages mediocrity. If it encourages mediocrity, could the proposition also give, this is more rhetorical, but could the proposition give an example of where a democratic state has been overrun by mediocrity? Propaganda, wherever it has been used, or supposedly used in democratic states, has been quickly flushed out by the populace, who are free to express their opinions and completely, totally make these views and lies spread by certain parties made irrelevant. So just cleaning that one up.
All right. Thank you very much. Next opinion for the motion.
I'm Ashani Basu from the Martineer for Girls, and I'll be speaking for the motion. Now, the reason why, there's only one reason why I think that the proposition has taken today's debate. It's because in the beginning of the debate, we had been told that, we won't be following an elitist form of view when we're debating. But members of the House today, they've negated the fact that not everyone has that rationality to make decisions. Today, I don't remember which speaker, but one of them said that if the media is trying to influence people, people can make, and I quote, educated decisions. But the fact is that today we're living in a country like India where not everyone has that education. They spoke about Man Ki Baat, and they said that, so Man Ki Baat is a radio channel where our Prime Minister Narendra Modi, he speaks and he speaks to the people. He speaks to the lower classes, he speaks to the villagers. Now, they don't know what is right. They know what the Prime Minister is telling them. They know that he's someone who's at that position of power. He knows that what they say is for their betterment, and they can't take that decision for themselves, which is why when they are told something via media, they know for a fact that this is what they should follow. Today, what is the fundamental principle of a democracy? What is something that each democracy follows? Voting. And today we are talking about how democracy encourages mediocrity just because of the fact that voting can be influenced via the whole picture of media, the whole fact that media is something that can be used to manipulate people. Today, they are confused about their definition of democracy and the relation between democracy and media. One of the previous speakers came and said that media needs democracy, media is important for democracy, whereas the last speaker came and negated the proposition's argument about media and democracy being compatible and said that media and democracy are indeed enemies. So members of the House, that is why today I feel that side proposition has taken this debate simply because they provided clarity with regard to the motion. Today, when they come here and tell you that a pluralistic view is the reason that this motion doesn't stand, it does not make sense simply, just wrapping up, it does not make sense simply because today they are telling you that there may be one situation, so how can you say the motion stands? But the problem is that they've said that in every democracy, be it the US or be it India, they've said that yes, we accept that one example is there.
All right, you should wrap up now, yeah.
Just wrapping up.
Yeah, finished.
Okay, they accept the fact
It's
that
wrapped up.
Concluding statement. All right. Fine.
Okay, finish your sentence.
They accept the fact that there are several examples which prove that the motion stands. Therefore, and that's why you should vote side opposition.
All right, fine. Next opinion for the motion, please. Yeah, you have a question? Yeah, go ahead. Makes it more interesting.
I would first of all like to correct the Right Honourable Lady about what I did say. I did say that humans have a natural intelligence to be able to critically analyse a situation to make an informed decision. So on that basis, regardless of a level of education, any form of being a human gives you a level of intelligence that allows you to analyse what your opinion is. But I would also like to suggest to her that she speaks about Modi campaigning and speaking directly to the people as a method of mediocrity. But that is not. That is democracy in action. It's him campaigning directly to the people, bypassing the media, as I spoke about earlier, so that he is able to remove their control in a democratic nation. Thus, there can be no mediocrity in a democratic nation.
All right. Next opinion, please. You don't have to respond to that. No, there are two more people who have lined up there. Yeah. And there is one more gentleman over there. Please, carry on. And no more clarifications because we are running out of time. So we'll just let them voice their opinion. Go ahead.
My name is Anupa Paul Chaudhary and I'm from Lamatnia for Girls. Just two things that I noticed on part of the opposition's arguments with regards to today's debate. Firstly, time and again, when the Democratic Republic of Korea and China was brought up, they refused to even acknowledge it on the basis that it is beyond the purview of today's debate. Now, what side opposition needs to realize is why it was brought up in the first place. It is because even the proposition accepts that these indeed aren't essentially democratic states in practice, and that is why they have brought it up, because they aren't democracies. Mediocrity is something which cannot exist in their state, which essentially shows to us that democracy is indeed required for mediocrity to exist in the first place, which makes the motion today stand that it is indeed democracy which encourages mediocrity regardless of who controls what. Secondly, today, the opposition has failed to take a holistic approach on the motion provided to us today, which is something that the proposition clearly has done. Today, they came up and continuously said that media has no control over democracy. What they need to understand is what essentially entails democracy, and what it is representatives of the people. And when today the proposition can prove that these representatives need media in order to come to power, need the media to campaign and mold public opinion, then it is indeed proven that it is democracy which encourages mediocrity. There's also public opinion, which also is something that entails democracy. And today the proposition can prove that it is the media, it is the media which can mold, if not manipulate, public opinion. Then once again the motion today stands. Thirdly, rights and freedoms. Another thing which is one of the aspects of democracy. Today, when people can manipulate their right to freedom of speech in order to propagate the entire concept of mediocrity in a democracy, then once again it is proved how democracy indeed encourages mediocrity.
Thank you. And I didn't manipulate the time. Okay, okay, next opinion.
Right. So what the opposition had to say about the people having many options, that the people can shift from one newspaper to the other. But let's understand this. In a democracy, you have freedom of expression. And with the true facts that every newspaper presents, it also presents its own opinion. Therefore, the biggest of media houses will obviously have a much greater influence on the people. And I feel that it's not like a David versus Goliath kind of situation. Even Australia has a lot of bowling options, but the reason why they choose Sean Tate over other bowlers is because of his intimidating height. Therefore, even though the people have a lot of options with them, you need to understand the magnitude of the expanse of a particular media house and the opinions they present, because democracy gives them the right to express their opinion, is the way by which democracy is encouraging a mediocrity. The word encouraging, I think, was clearly ignored by the opposition. It was proposition who rightly brought up the fact that even if democratic principles give you the slightest leeway to bring up mediocrity, this motion indeed passes. And therefore, I feel it is the proposition that takes this debate.
All right, thank you very much. Sean, you want to speak for the motion?
Yes, I do, because as Harrow's debate coach, I feel duty-bound, I think, to roast them at every opportunity I get. So here goes, guys.
So he's only doing overtime now.
You gave some analysis that the Leave campaign won, and it didn't get that great media coverage, so case closed, we can all go home now, it's settled, there's no mediocrity. But here's a question for you guys. Why did we have an EU referendum? Because I've worked in politics for 9 years. I go around, I speak to voters all the time, and they speak to me about all sorts of things. They talk about healthcare, they talk about education, policing, transport, job opportunities, the wider economy. What they don't say is, you know what keeps me up at night? EU Directive 21B. That's the thing that drives me crazy, okay? You know what keeps me up at night? The Treaty of Rome. That's what I lose sleep over every single night. That didn't happen. But you know who hated the EU? Rupert Murdoch, with all his breath. There's a famous Murdoch quote, actually. I love Downing Street. When I go there, they say, what can we do for you, Mr. Murdoch? When he rolls into Brussels, they say, who are you, Mr. Murdoch? So why we had the EU referendum suggests there is already a mediocracy. It's affecting our democracy because it's literally affecting the things that we vote on. So better luck next time, guys. Okay? In terms of accountability being the readers, the subscribers, the eventual customers of media, that's rubbish. Okay? Most media across the world in almost all countries, including Australia, the United States, and the United Kingdom, loses money. So that bears the question, why on earth do we have this media in the first place? Because it gives the owners power over politics, and people like Rupert Murdoch and Evgeny Lebedev and the media barons of the United Kingdom have business interests outside the media, and they use it to drive those agendas. A big one is climate change. Many climate change deniers appear on Fox Network and various Murdoch-owned press. Is that a coincidence? I suspect not. So media is driving the agenda on things like climate change, and also it's the reason we had the EU referendum in the first place. So what's your answer, Harrow boys? Come on.
All right, Sean. Sean, thank you very much for being on the job 24/7.
Thank you very much, Dr. Dolan. I would like to open by saying that thank you for your attempted roast. As our debating coach, we feel very supported in your constant support of us. We would like to say, to your point on Rupert Murdoch not liking the EU and then us having an EU referendum, that correlation does not prove causation. The simple fact that Rupert Murdoch didn't like the EU is not necessarily the cause of why we had an EU referendum. Probably the main reason why we had an EU referendum was because the Conservative Party was split. There was a massive divide between those who hated the EU and who disliked it and wanted to stay in. And David Cameron, the leader of the government at the time, could not maintain this split in his party. Furthermore, UKIP, a similar right-wing party, was stealing his votes because people who hated the EU were voting for UKIP so they could put pressure on the government to leave the EU. So essentially, the move which he did in the 2015 referendum to say that he was going to hold an EU referendum was essentially just a vote grab by David Cameron to try and make sure that he didn't lose his seats, and he didn't create division in his party. He managed to get a full majority in the 2015 election, but now, if you look at the Brexit process, his party is more divided than ever. So some successes and some failures.
All right,
thank you, Mr. Moshoop. We'll call your speech the roaster roasted. Yeah.
All right.
I'd just like to answer one question that was asked. We didn't discuss the Irish because we are Irish. The only person who's Irish is our coach. Just like to clear that up before we finish. Thank you.
All right. To take this debate to a logical conclusion, we have to put the motion to vote. Yeah, the House has to vote.
You know, Sean, you've provoked something that's beyond, it was quite, because you've raised the hackles of a certain gentleman standing in the wings called Dr. Sandeep Chatterjee. Now, he wants to take you on, so Sandeep insists on making some concluding comments, and so after that, we'll put the motion to vote.
I'm not taking anybody on. I'm just wearing my hat as one of the founder trustees of the Calcutta Debating Society to thank you. And just to reduce the boredom, I'll just summarize what you've heard before you vote. You know, in this motion, we've got the word crassy mentioned twice. You will be aware that the word crassy comes from the Latin kratos, which means rule by. So we have an option of rule by demos, which is what democracy is, which is demos means citizens of a city. Read here, citizens of a country, versus rule by media. So fundamentally, what the motion says is, in a democracy, which is a crassy or a rule by the majority of its citizens, is a system where the government encourages rule by the media. Now, how ridiculous is that? If I can rule, why should I want to subjugate my powers to somebody else called the media, good or bad? So it is ridiculous to even think that in a democracy, which is a government which is controlled by the citizens, that this government will want to try and encourage its powers to go to another group called the media, good, bad, or social. That's very simple. The problem is that Queen wrote a song called "If You Can't Beat Them, Join Them." And if the government has to say it's a democratic government, it has to promote the media. Unfortunately, in a democracy, it cannot control the media. But as we know too well, at least in this country and in the United Kingdom and in the United States, there is one other alternative. The party in power can buy the media houses. And that's the argument on the other side, that how the governments of democratic governments encourage media is they encourage the media to be powerful, but then they buy the media. So they are the owners of the media. And we've just heard that from Sean in not so many words. And that's been the argument. And I think if you want to sum up the arguments we've heard, I think the side opposition has told us that the relationship between a democratic government and its media is the relationship between a lady and a husband. It's a relationship which is based on agonists, a relationship, if you like, between a substrate and its catalyst, a relationship where the balance of power is perfect and complete and bipartite. The side government has told us the relationship between a democracy and a media, a democratic government and its media, is more like the relationship between a prostitute and her client. The relationship is of convenience, strict terms are strictly cash. The relationship is temporary and it never bears fruit. And these are the two sides that you have to think about when you vote either for or against the motion. Just to finish, it is my pleasant duty to offer a small vote of thanks on behalf of the Calcutta Debating Circle. And my first duty is to offer my vote of thanks to a school which came into being in the year that Emperor Akbar decided he should transfer his capital to Fatehpur Sikri, 1572, when by a charter of Queen Elizabeth I, a school was established in London called the Harrow School. And whereas the act of Emperor Akbar resulted in a capital being dreary, deserted, and full of drought, a mistake that he was to regret and need to correct later on, the act of Queen Elizabeth I resulted in 7 prime ministers and 5 Nobel laureates being produced from the school that we have had the pleasure of listening to in the last 7 days. And a big applause, a bigger applause for the Harrow School from London. It is difficult to be in a foreign terrain. It is more difficult to be in a foreign terrain and have foreign audience. It is even more difficult to be in a foreign terrain in front of foreign audience and have foreign adversaries supported by the foreign audience. And I think they deserve really a very big applause. The other schools that deserve equal applause are the Newtown School, La Martiniere for girls, La Martiniere for boys, the BSS School, the Adamus International School, and the Vivekananda Mission School, all of whom have participated to make this a very enjoyable debating week. It would be necessary for me to mention the names of our sponsors, our presenting sponsor, the Akash Institute, whose refuge a lot of you will seek in the days to come. Our unput-downable media partner, The Telegraph, who we don't like to upset even in topics based about the media. Adamus University, Medica Super Speciality Hospital, I hope you don't need to go there. Mega Moda, the Kolkata Heart Foundation, Lions District 322, and Khadims. And finally, I'd like to thank the audience. You've been a great audience and you've made all our efforts worthwhile. Thank you very much.
motion to vote. And may I request all those who feel that the better team today was team opposition, who opposed the motion which reads, democracy encourages mediocrity. Those who think the opposition spoke better, may I request you to raise your hands.
Oh, that's interesting.
One hand. Yes, thank you, young man.
You have 30 more seconds to raise your hand if you haven't so far.
And how many of you feel that it was side proposition that spoke better and carried the day? One hand, please. I can see a lady. One hand only. Okay, your 7 is also counted.
I think very clearly the opposition has won.
I think very clearly the opposition has carried the day.